tātou hui.
Where's our karakia? I'll borrow one of theirs. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa o ngā rangatira o Te Rohi. Ka nui te mihi ki a koutou katoa. Thank you very much for the opportunity to start in karakia. I'm going to use the Hawke's Bay Regional Council Akuranga Putukara and open our meeting with one of your team's karakias. I noi tātou. E te atua manaaki tia mai mātou me a mātou mahi I tēnei wā I runga I tō ingoa tapu. Āmene. Nice and short.
Well done, Regional Council.
Can't lie. They're available over in the corner for those of you who'd like to acquire one. They're awesome.
Hi, Tuka.
Ngā mihi. Okay, do we have any apologies?
Rick Barker.
Tanya Hopmans. Someone move the apologies be accepted.
Aye.
Aye and aye. Thank you. Any new conflicts of interest declarations we need to be aware of today? That's fine. Notices, do we have any regard to those? Okay. Confirmation of the minutes.
Sorry, Chair, I think in terms of notices there is a late item.
Late items, which has been
proposed.
Sorry, the late item.
Yep. Okay. Can we someone move we receive the late items?
Aye.
Okay. Second that? Aye. All in favour? Thank you. Confirmation of the minutes held on the 14th of August. Can I have someone move that they be a correct record of what transpired?
Mr Chair. Mr Chair. Look, I'd just like to take you to the apologies.
Yep.
And note that I in fact had a leave of absence during that time and therefore should have had recorded an apology for that meeting.
Okay. Everyone in agreement we can correct that minute?
Happy with that amendment.
Thank you. Yep. Any other matters arising? Okay. All in favour?
Aye.
Thank you. Up here and, who was the second of that one? Oh. Okay, we hand over to our CEO for follow-ups.
So we'll take this one, just the one there. Thomas, anything you want to add to that?
Yes, I know that it has been recorded as a follow-up. It does feel more like it's an ongoing part of the process that we're going to go through for as we have workshops and discussion around the tank plan change, and I think this follow-up reflects the agreement that was reached around the process and the need for further reports to be requested, further information to be reported to this committee. We did receive a request prior to the current pack that you have going out. We haven't been able to formally respond to that request. A, because I think a lot of the matters in that request were satisfied within the report pack that went out and the briefing papers contained in that report. B, because we were sort of preoccupied with the item that has come up as a late notice for this meeting. So, and I note that, so I'm happy to field any specific questions around the nature of the follow-ups, but I do just simply acknowledge that we have an agreed process and we'll do our best to satisfy those information requests as they fall through.
Okay, the follow-up item has been noted, and we'll move on to a call for items of business not on the agenda. I understand there was one in regard to outstanding water bodies or something.
Yep, that's the late item here, I think.
Yep.
For the inclusion of the Tutaikuri River. So that's all
Any further items?
He's talking to them, talking to them.
Me, Ngāti Tūreita.
Geez, you're with us.
I've been here now.
Okay, someone move that that we accept. Oh, where am I? That we accept the item not on the agenda.
And the late item, I think.
I'll move it.
Yeah. Second that.
I'm happy to second that.
So just for clarity, sorry, Chair.
Yes.
Just for clarity, just in discussions with Tanya Hotmans, it was agreed that in order to be able to make a decision on this item today, which we're all very keen to do, I believe, that the item was withdrawn as a matter that would be brought up as a minor item and has been now included as a late item so that this committee can vote on that.
Late item. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. All in favour?
Aye.
Thank you. Item 6, oil and gas plan change options.
So I'm going to invite Rena Douglas up to speak to this. I believe actually Rena has presented this paper to the committee, but we may have not had a quorum at the time, but we agreed to proceed with the meeting. So this really just covers off the developments that this government, the matter for this committee to consider as to whether this government's efforts have overtaken the efforts of this council in respect to progressing the plan change. And so I'll let Rena continue with the discussion.
Thank you, Tom. Welcome, Rena.
Namahi koutou. The paper is broken down into several sections. One of them traverses the government's announcements in regards to the oil and gas issue, followed by a staff analysis of some of the options for council, including a breakdown of some of the pros and cons of going with those options. And we've also got some discussion around the financial implications. What we are seeking from council today is a decision about what we do next. But just to wind it back a step, this paper was deferred from a RPC meeting of several months ago. And since then, we've been in regular contact with our counterparts at Ministry for the Business, Innovation and Employment, and they have only recently advised us that the Minister for Energy and Resources intends to take a paper through Cabinet which outlines the next steps for the Crown Minerals Act. So as you may be aware, the Crown Minerals Act is important here because it is the piece of legislation that governs petroleum, oil and gas exploration in New Zealand, and the implications for us is that we will get a clearer signal as to whether or not the legislation will be amended to in some way ban or curtail exploration for petroleum in New Zealand or control it in a different way. So in my discussions with those officials, we don't really know what the content of that legislative amendment looks like. Well, we know that it's coming and it's being discussed at the moment. So
what's the time frame for that?
they weren't able to give us an indication. I understand that this issue was discussed in the House in late August, but the Minister was vague on her intentions. So we've got a couple of options here. One is that we proceed with the plan change. So that just steps through, we recommence our consultation in accordance with the project plan. We bring it through to public submissions, hold hearings. We follow the standard process. There are some risks or things to consider there. We may, it might result in quite a bit of unnecessary expenditure given that the government is taking the steps that it is taking. Also, we may run the risk of acting before we know the full implications of the government's plans for the Crown Minerals Act. So that's something to consider there. The second option is really shelving this current work program but incorporating it into the review of the Regional Resource Management Plan and the Regional Coastal Environment Plan, which is scheduled at this stage for 2020. So we would repackage all the work reports, etc. we've done today and funnel it into that plan change. And the pros of that is that it's a bit more coordinated in terms of all the other planning documents that we have for the region. And it also may go to the heart of cutting, some unnecessary expenditure around, carrying on this current path, again, because the government has already made these announcements. Yeah, so just to make some comments, I guess, on the broader risks for Hawke's Bay, to reiterate the Crown's position, which is that there are no new offshore oil and gas permits to be granted, except for those under the block offer for offshore Taranaki only. So that is not Hawke's Bay at all. There is one existing exploration permit, which I included the map for on the first page of this report, which grazes into the Hawke's Bay rohe very, very slightly. I understand, and yeah, these announcements that the government has made will not affect existing permits. So there is, and I checked yesterday, the Crown Minerals website to look at the permit map and just to see that there were no changes. And as of yesterday, there is that one permit. So I guess we can take from the flavour of the Crown's announcements to date that they aren't going to be looking at the Hawke's Bay as somewhere for permitting. For oil and gas.
So we're looking at the square at the bottom?
We are looking. Yeah, sorry. So you'll see the permit number 5.
Just comes into our...
Yeah, just grazes slightly into our rohe there.
Okay.
Yeah. So with that being said, I'm happy to take questions and comments.
Question, Chair. How much does it cost for us to proceed? Anyway.
That's a good question. I'd have to go away and do some more.
Throwaway comment. 200 grand, 300 grand?
There's about $85,000 left in this budget.
Yeah. So taking into account we have to carry out public consultation, there'd be a hearings or potential hearings processes, all the normal steps that go with a plan change. I'd be loath to put a figure on.
Certainly a lot of staff time.
Yeah, considerable staff time.
You can't even give me a estimate, but it's not 5 million, is it?
No.
So can we get close to where it could be?
200 or
200? Yeah.
200?
Yeah.
No.
By
So,
the time the whole thing's complete. But of course, one of the things that we said at the outset about this that we couldn't provide you with any certainty around is how litigated this could
Yes.
be by industry, and therefore how much we might spend on legal fees and a legal battle at the other end of it. That's an unknown quantity.
Thank you, Chair. I know somewhere in here you mentioned about the onshore block offers or permits that Tag's one had expired. Did you have any idea what happened to the Endeavour or Marauder permit, which was just north of Tag's one? Has that been expired or handed in as well?
My understanding that there's only one permit in current existence that affects Hawke's Bay. So I guess that one's been expired or relinquished to NZPNM.
Because I know how challenging it is now to find those things on the website. Like they used to be real easy, but now they seem to be a bit more challenging to come across.
Yeah.
Councillor, would you like us to take that as a follow-up, just to
Yeah, if you could.
close that?
I could come up with a permit. I need to go back and check my records for the permit number for you.
So you happy to take it as a follow-up, or
Yeah,
would you like?
I'll come back with a permit number for you.
Okay, so any more questions?
Mr. Chair, got a couple of questions, and this really comes from being a newbie at the table, basically. So, quite pro option 2, and I'm just wondering whether or not are there any indicators from central government that the policy that they're hoping to build around gas and oil will also include mineral exploration along our catchment areas?
I haven't had any discussions on that. I can go and follow that up. My understanding is that these announcements relate purely to oil and gas and petroleum.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I understand the drivers around putting in place policy for oil and gas at a central government level, is there any flow-on effect with regards to any of our regional councils wanting to address the technology that was employed at the time specifically? I'm still trying to protect us from the likes of the Amazon coming back, basically.
So can you go into a bit more detail on what you mean by that?
So my understanding was that on top of the gas and oil, a part of the exploration brief for the Amazon was to look at mineral deposits within the ocean bed. So that's fine. But my concern is the technology employed, which is that sonic boom and sonic systems on the ocean floor, and the impacts on our marine environment. There's been no sort of... So I understand government wants to push policy with around gas and oil, but I'm more concerned around the technology used to acquire that data and whether or not that's also going to be included in central government's aims. I know it's a big ask, seeing as you don't sit in cabinet, and what it's leading to is whether or not, if we do adopt option 2, whether or not we can assume in future reviews and policy development that we have an oil and gas prohibition in place, even though we're waiting on government to actually formalise that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I'll answer the first part of your question first. The technology question is difficult because the technology employed by explorers isn't just used for detecting anomalies on the sea floor. So that's used for a variety of things. So I'm not sure if that ban will go to prohibiting that level of technology. And also, I go back to my point that oil and gas, technology used to detect oil and gas prospectivity and technology used to detect mineral deposits can be quite different. So again, I'm happy to go and seek some clarity for you on that. Yeah.
Can I just ask a follow-up question to that? And it's probably asking the same question, but in a slightly different way. If we went ahead with this plan change, what are the prospects that the government might end up passing measures that would put us in conflict with the plan change that we've just passed?
So do you mean reversing the current view, or?
No, that they pass things that would render some of the things that we've gone through a plan change and done no longer lawful or legal.
I think that's a question for...
They'd have to be amendments to the RMA. So all the changes the government's looking at around the Crown Minerals Act, so it's around the allocation of these resources for extraction. Changes we're making regulations under the RMA, so there would have to be RMA amendments that would cut across what we're doing. And there's none of those being foreshadowed by government at this stage.
Further question, Chair?
Yes.
So if we were to pass option two, the recommendations as they are, there's nothing to preclude us from revisiting this if the changes that the government made don't meet us, satisfaction or our requirement.
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, the work's done. It's sitting there.
Yep.
It'll be a matter of picking it up and making it relevant for what that time was.
Hence the term shelving as opposed to abandoning.
Yep.
But the only implication will be resourcing in terms of if you redirect these funds towards another activity.
Yep. I'm ready to move, Chair, if further questions.
Yep.
You got another question?
Second?
I was happy to move, but I'm happy to second that.
Okay, right. Move a second.
Where are you moving?
Option 2.
Well,
Cease further work.
Yeah.
yep.
Okay. You want to speak to your motion?
Yeah, I was just going to say it's fantastical that the government has come in and made that announcement and has taken that pressure off us to be able to do something.
Oh, just to say, Chair, I didn't support this right at the outset on the basis that it would be a long, costly, drawn-out, litigated process, and the world's moved on. I mean, the government's made their call, and let's get on and do some real work.
Okay. Anyone else want to?
I strongly supported the move to have this plan change made because I was looking for an opportunity to punch the government in the nose on this issue, and I regret that I will now not have that opportunity because the government has moved ahead of me. So I'm happy to support this option 2.
Okay. I think we're done and dusted here. All in favour?
Aye.
Thank you. Okay, we're on to the deeper subject of the tank plan change. So, hand it back to
So we're going to invite Mary Ann, who you got to know very well last month, as she took us through the plan change, and I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Jeff Smith, who's one of our chiefs, our science team leaders, and particularly in the area of hydrology, so very relevant to today's discussion. So we'll take you through a high level. We appreciate and understand that it is incredibly complex set of issues that we've put in front of you, and these are issues that the Tank Group did get to consider over many days and through the reading of many deep reports. So, but I think I'm sure we'll be able to answer your questions and just look forward to progressing the discussion to the next step. So, Mary Ann, are you happy to lead off?
Good morning, everyone. Just before I start, oops, I can get back again. All right. I just wanted to acknowledge the reports that you've got in relation to the tank decisions today rely heavily on some of the science input that the tank have had, and Jeff Smith is here alongside me to answer any technical questions that you might have, and also to note that the main author for the high flow provisions or sections of this report are by Kerry Edmonds, not me, but she's not here today, so we'll cover that report for her. So the slideshow is not going to go into any sort of technical detail. It's really just a very brief overview of the findings of the Tank Group, the issues and what they agreed, and what the outstanding options for your consideration are.
Are you happy to take questions while you're...
As we go,
Okay,
that's fine.
Okay, that's fine.
Right, so there are several non-consensus issues that we are going to be bringing to your decision making, and today we're going to be looking at the high flow allocation limits, the flow enhancement of lowland streams, and minimum flows and allocation limits for the two main rivers in the tank catchments. So there are still some topics that we yet have to report to you on, and one of those is managing nutrient loss risks as a result of land use change, the protection of drinking water supplies, some amendments to the stormwater provisions, and that's also relating to discussions that you had at the workshop. And we will be coming back to you eventually with a version 8 with final recommendations to mop up some of the detail and the consequential amendments that will be necessary as a result of any of your directions. And then there's some decisions around consultation and notification that will eventually come past this table. So in terms of the high flow allocation limits, the issues that were identified by the Tank Group were that the easy water, the surface and groundwater allocation limits are now met or exceeded across the tank catchments, but there is also an ongoing demand for water. One of the issues is around understanding that growing demand for water and providing for both current and future foreseeable water needs. And there are a range of methods that the plan addresses and includes things like water conservation and efficient use of water, good allocation regimes so that we have efficient administrative processes in place. Water reticulation is also a solution in some places, and we're also looking at aquifer recharge flow enhancement, which I'll come to later, and storage and augmentation options, which is the key focus of the first issue around high flow allocation. And if you don't manage that high flow allocation, it does have the potential to impact on the river morphology and the hydrological functioning of the river. So it is important that limits are considered for that high flow just as much as they are necessary for low flow protections.
Do we get copies of this?
Of the presentation? Yep. So the draft plan in relation to the agreements that the group came to provides currently for a limit for high flow abstraction, and that the free 3 statistic or parameter is the way that we assess the effects of that high flow allocation, and free 3 is the number of times that the flow exceeds 3 times the median flow, so it's high flows. Change to the free 3 is a measure of how the river maintains its hydrological integrity and its morphology and its ecological function. And it was agreed that by the group that change by no more than 10% will limit the impact of those high flow abstractions to an acceptable level. But what they couldn't agree was how much change. So any up to 10, but not exceeding 10. And the group also agreed on some provisions around damming the main stems of several named, of the 2 main stems and some of the tributaries of those main stems. So those were the agreements that the tank group came to in relation to high flow allocations and storage. But they couldn't decide how much change was appropriate in relation to protecting those river functions, and looked at a range from 6 to 12 cubic metres per second as being an acceptable allocation limit.
Excuse me, in terms of a background, what are the drivers in terms of this? Is it to maintain the status quo in terms of the economic drives, or is it more so to generate change for sustainable management?
It's more around setting the limits within which resources can be used. And now that there are quite clear limits to the surface and groundwater abstraction, and also acknowledging that the demand for water is ongoing with urban development as well as for primary production or industry, this decision is around setting the limits within that future water demand can be met.
Well, would it be correct to say, Marianne, that the high flow limits, as proposed, provide for greater abstraction for water storage, and that water storage may be used in part for flow augmentation, therefore environmental enhancement?
That could be an end use for it as well, yeah.
Yeah, just another question. Does augmentation mask issues in terms of the springs, with in the upper reaches? Does it mask their depletion?
Might be something more for...
Is the question about augmentation of the main stem of the Ngāruaroa Tūtaukuri? Is that the...
Well, I understand that there are lots of streams that run through different properties, and in order for there to be agreed sustainable standards, they pump water into those streams, but the water that's been depleted is from the springs upstream.
So that's the lowland stream augmentation. That's probably the next item.
Issue. This is more about abstracting water at times when the river is flowing high and put into storage or augmentation.
From the main stem of the Ngāruaroa.
Or cumulatively in terms of the impact of several smaller augmentation schemes as well. So looking at cumulative impacts of that high flow storage.
Thank you.
Question, why is there a need to for augmentation given the current levels of allocation?
Well, the current levels are shown to be either, the allocation limits are either fully met or over-allocated. So we're going to have to reduce the amount that we've allocated, and also acknowledge that the demand for water is not a static thing. It changes and will probably increase with increasing population or further irrigation. So there is a need to look to the future for foreseeable future demands as well as the current. And this allows for decisions to be made that are sustainable around meeting those future needs.
Sustainability, I'm just trying to get my head around how it's sustainable when you've said that it's already over-allocated and we've got a growing population. So therefore, in order to meet the current situation, augmentation is the answer. So, well, an option. So I'm trying to understand how you can mitigate or manage against the over-allocation growth, because that's been implied. So, yeah.
So the plan has a number of policies and rules around reducing the level of over-allocation. So we're phasing out over-allocation at times of low flow. So those provisions are in the plan already or in the draft. And what we're looking at now is a future opportunity for water storage or augmentation or reticulation, those sorts of things, to meet that future demand, or the gap between what the allocation limit provides for and what the demand is for.
So what's the proportion of over-allocation and percentage-wise, and what have you planned for in the future and percentage-wise of that water and the overflow? So augmentation percentage, what's the current over-allocation percentage now?
I'm not sure if I exactly understand the percentages you're talking about, but the level of over-allocation depends on which water body you're looking at and what the allocation limit is. So for...
We're asking, sorry, just to clarify, Jenny, are you asking about abstraction from surface takes, or are you talking about from the aquifer?
Well, if they're both included, I suppose I'm covering both. But my query is, if we're over-allocated, by how much? What length of time does it take to reduce the over-allocation? And I get the augmentation if we take into climate change and the intensity of water and utilising that for storage, but it's the over-allocation and how you manage that. I'm trying to figure out how you would mitigate and manage that not occurring again in the future.
So,
and so augmentation would then primarily, in my head, be thinking we'd use it for innovative projects as opposed to managing over-allocation.
No, the allocations for high flow are separate to managing the takes at low flow. So there are quite stringent rules around allocation limits and how much can be allocated within those limits, with policies to reduce the amount of the over-allocation. So that's a separate issue to now looking at what are the opportunities for high flow storage.
Aaron, I think Jenny's asking a much bigger set question. You're having a quite specific conversation about a specific element of the policy here. She's asking a far more fundamental question about actually the role of augmentation and the overall allocation. So the over-allocation, if you like, is largely a paper allocation, because we know we've allocated significantly more than is being used. It was 170, so from the aquifer, we know that the maximum, well, estimated the maximum take in the driest time was about 90 million cubes, and on paper there has been allocated as 170 or 140?
Oh, somewhere between 140 and 180, right. A little bit uncertain.
On paper has been allocated, so that needs to come back to, that paper allocation needs to come back, and is proposed in the policy to come back to 90, which is the maximum take estimated in the driest year that we've had historically. So that becomes then the new allocation of the aquifer system, of the groundwater. Even at that level, there are environmental effects, and even if we clawed that back further, there's still going to be environmental effects, because we take water from the ground, it depressurises the springs, it has an environmental effect in summer, and so then the questions become, do you manage that effect by taking more and more water off people with impacts on horticulture and communities' availability of water, etc., and try and get better spring flows? Or is a more cost-effective way of doing that in the short term, given that it's a relatively small period of time you're talking about where this is a problem, you take groundwater and augment to mitigate the effects of the overall current take. And so that is what's proposed at the moment. And the journey that the TANK group had to go through was probably a starting position. Let's wind back everybody's takes so we can get to a point where the springs flow as well as they're going to in summer. And the modelling showed to do that effectively, it would have to be incredibly drastic reductions, and it would have to be right across the board with major economic and social dislocation as a consequence to get that additional spring flow in the middle of summer. So the TANK group agreed. I think at least, probably with consensus at least on that point, that the winding right back the allocation to the extent that would have to be necessary was not the way to go. Then the question became, should we all bid? Does that?
I understand that,
Yep.
and so thank you for that, though. It's always good to reinforce, but so where does sustainability come into it? Because that's about maintaining the current status. It's not about sustaining the future, and I do note that in the climate change area, we only have a policy, and there's no mitigation to that, and we're already experiencing the intensity of climate change, and it's only going to get more intense. So I suppose my questions were around, are we maintaining it? Because I can't see it. It's not a sustainable option. It's maintaining the current status, as I see it.
So perhaps Jeff will comment on this, because as I understand it, the science suggests that at this level of take, it is sustainable, even with some climate modelling, although in the long term there is a high degree of uncertainty about what climate change will ultimately deliver for us.
Yeah, happy to comment on that. I think in terms of the bigger picture, the first thing is that augmentation is not pitched as being the answer or a silver bullet. It's part of a package of solutions to mitigate or remedy those effects that are occurring. So it's not going to stay the same in that respect. And also climate change is a really interesting one, and I think that's one of the key strategies to meet the problems associated with the climate change is storage of water. And that's what this high flow allocation is intended to do, is to provide water to meet those periods, those dry periods.
I suppose my last comment on this is that whilst the over-allocation is a paper one, that tells me there's no guarantees that it won't be maintained. I mean, people could dive in and use it all, and they can't.
So the policy that's been proposed, and it was a move that the council has made ahead of this plan, was to effectively not allocate any more water, and part of this process, and it's been obviously a big part of the tank discussion, is to wind that allocation back to not a paper allocation or a theoretical allocation that provides any more headroom for water to be taken, but to be wound back to what people actually need to use now. That's the groundwater allocation.
So then that goes back to my original question, how long would that take?
How long will it take?
How will it take to wind down to the level that you think is good for allocation on paper? And how will that work with the proposed augmentation and timing? You know, if you're winding down allocation and then you're going to be doing the high flow, what's the time frames? Do they work together? Are they synchronised?
I think that in terms of winding back the allocation, we've already stopped accepting or permitting more water takes from the aquifer. So in that respect, it's down to actual use at the moment. And it's not as difficult to wind back the paper allocation as it is to wind back the actual use. So it's, if you like, to get it down to actual use now, it's just a matter of people having what they need and no excess that they're not using anyway. And in terms of the other projects, the timeframes vary in the plan. In terms of storage and what have you, that will require some planning and development to get those in place. So it's not all going to happen at once.
Look, I'd say the minimum of 5 years probably to get some storage up, and then in terms of winding back the paper allocation, we've got to go through consent reviews. Most of them have been put on short-term rollovers, and the bulk of them come up for review next year and the year after. So we'll have most of them done within a sort of a 2 to 3 year time frame. And then one of the issues we face is that given the delays on this, and if we continue to have delays in notifying this plan change and we get into issues next year, we'll have to just roll over more and more of those consents on a short-term basis to give us the opportunity to make the changes to the paper allocation in a timely manner.
Thank you.
Given there's going to be, well, one of the proposed ideas is storage, dams and whatever, do we have a requirement for some fish passage mechanisms?
So what this high flow allocation is doing is just setting aside water that could be used for storage. The actual storage projects themselves would go through their own consenting process where fish passage and other issues would be discussed or considered. And if we don't have this provided for in the plan, it makes it so much harder for any sort of, really valuable storage project to get off the ground because there won't be an allocation for it. So it's just setting aside the water at this stage.
From our point of view, it needs to be mandatory.
So screening of takes, of surface takes to prevent fish capture is a standard provision in the existing plan and is a standard requirement in all of our consents. So when you're talking about fish passage, you're talking about a dam structure.
To go through their natural processes and breed up river and all the rest of it.
Just got another question following on from your kōrero, James. What is the mitigation around the depletion and the risks of the depletion of the puna, the springs? Because they are of cultural significance, and so what mitigations have been made around the risk of those puna being depleted?
So they're already depleted, and look, there's a range of things. There is obviously the shading and planting programs that are already underway and envisaged, because of course that helps with water quality, water temperature in particular. There is the augmentation that's planned as well, and most importantly, of course, no further allocation so that we don't exacerbate the current effects. But is there something else you want to add?
Well, I just wonder, we're going way off the topic that we've got in front of you for the decision, and a lot of what you're asking is provided for in the draft, and I'm more than happy to go through some of the detail that I think you're looking for in terms of what the rest of the plan says. So if that is a way forward at this stage.
So it's in the rest of the plan, but not in the decisions being made today?
That's right, yeah.
Which part? Yeah, okay.
Chair, I wonder if we go through the presentation and then for people who need a deeper dive, it can go into a workshop rather than...
Okay, yeah.
I mean, we're already 3/4 of an hour.
All we're concerned about is a death of 1,000 cuts, You agree to something and it actually it pulls you into something else later.
And we have got the workshop planned for the 19th, so we've got some topics that we can dive into a bit more deeply.
So high flow allocation, that's the...
So those were the choices, and these numbers are somewhat arbitrary, but we stuck with the 6, the 8 and the 12 cubic metres, and they were modelled to see what the effect would be. And the recommendation that that we are making as staff is that option B, it provides a conservative limit. It's within the free 10% change. It provides for foreseeable demand, and it can be reviewed at some later date if necessary. The downside of the 6.3% for some is that it is conservative. It could possibly go higher, but the science at the moment is supporting a reasonably conservative 6.3% change to free 3. So that's the recommendation that we're making. The second issue, going on to...
Can I ask questions about respect to the paper regarding the low flow issue, the high flow take before you jump into the next one? On page 16, you've got a figure 1 there with a cross-section of obviously a waterway of some sort. You've got the high flow allocation flow sharing at the top, then environmental flow, then core allocation, then environmental flow. Can you explain to me why environmental flow has been cut in half by core allocation? I would have thought...
I can probably answer that. So the bottom one is in relation to the bare minimum water you want there, obviously, in dry times. The environmental flow above that is your high flow variability that you would want for essentially the frequency of the flow variability. So So you've got two environmental parameters you're trying to manage. One is how low are you prepared to let the stream go in summer? The other environmental parameter is how much water do you want bouncing around when there's rainfall, etc., to give natural variability to the ecosystem. So there are two different environmental dynamics you're managing.
I'm a little, I need, you know, these are really complex issues, right? And we've been dumped with these papers and we're trying to understand them.
Yeah.
And I am having trouble understanding that explanation because it seems pretty clear to me. Environmental flows are obviously what's left in the river first.
Yeah.
And everything after it is an issue.
So this goes to the core of what this whole subject, this item's about. I think we just need to step everybody back a little bit through understanding why a high flow allocation mechanism is important, because we're not just talking about what's left in dry summers, we're also talking about how do we manage the river so it has natural fluctuations, because to be crude about it, if you wanted to skim off all the water in the middle of winter or whenever there's rainfall, you could create a really flat character to flows in the river.
Yep.
You want it to continue to have natural fluctuations because the ecology requires that and the geomorphology of the river requires there to be variability. Okay. So what we're also trying to manage is what gets skimmed off the top as well as what's left in the bottom.
Okay, so that's pointed out in the memo on figure 2, page 36 of your attachment 1. Which you've given a graph there with the fluctuations in the river level and your free limit, your free number in the high flow storage, and so on and so on. But that's only the flows during the summer, because it's from December to June. Where's the rest of the year?
36.
That was just shown as an example. The rest of the year is represented in the statistics that we did. But this is to show, like, the bottom red dotted line is your current minimum flow.
Yeah, can I just suggest, I found that really easy to follow. Giving me a whole bunch of statistics is a little challenging. Because I can understand that, and as soon as I see that there's 6 months missing out of a graph like that, I get a bit lost. So,
just to demonstrate what a free event is, what a free 3 event is.
James, isn't the top section of environmental flow, that's to make sure that the pebbles are rolled?
Correct.
The graphite and it moves down the river.
Correct.
So can I just ask a supplementary question on this as well? So what the staff are proposing is that up to 8 cubic metres a second can be taken off and used and put into storage in times of high flow. What is the minimum flow rate in the river when that's going to be permitted?
20 cubics, which is the median flow.
Right, and the minimum flow is 2.4 currently.
Correct.
So it's, I don't know, 8 times. Yeah. So you can only take water off for storage when the river's running at 8 times its a minimum flow.
Yeah, correct. You can see that on figure 2, the 2 lower red lines. The dotted line is the current minimum flow for run a river takes. Yep. And then at 20 cubics, there's that high flow allocation minimum flow as well.
Right. Okay. That sounds pretty sensible to me.
Any further questions? You want, Carol?
Do you want resolutions as we go, Mr. Chairman, or how are we going to handle this?
Up to you, up to the committee.
Certainly presented all at the end, the 4 principal recommendations. It would probably be easier if we just go through the presentations, take all the questions, and then just vote on them as a package.
Further questioning on this particular one. In page 18, paragraph 17, you talk about Pickens has done a report which has said that there is further 3,500 hectares and demand could be met by 17.5 million cubic metres. I get that. Can give us a rough idea what was the intended use? I mean, how was that 17.5 million cubes come up to? What was he making assumptions based on current usage on the plains or however? How did he come up with that number?
Yeah, it was. They did some storage modelling, so how big a reservoir you'd need to irrigate those based on efficient irrigation on that 3,500 hectares.
And that was based on what is current usage for irrigation on the plains, or?
I think so, but I'll check that and come back to you at the workshop.
If you could, thanks.
Yeah.
And page 19, this comes back to the recommendation, 27B, any takes to storage existing that it will continue to provide it with the new blah blah blah. Is that necessary exactly, or is it just in there for some sort of clarification, that particular paragraph? Page 19. The reporting officer's recommendation. You've got 27B.
That's the rest of the policy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is that, I looked at that and I thought that was superfluous.
There are some current high flow takes with lower minimum flows, the sort of takes to storage at the moment, which have flows at Whanawhana, for instance, of 12 cumex. So that's allowing those to continue based on the current assessments of effects that they've had done for their consents.
But they're still within the allocation limit. So
So they would still be within the
within the 8
the six,
or the 6, yeah.
6.3.
Yeah.
So that clause is in there in case anything happens. That would, to me, it looks like an and and an end, or but and an and. I go back to the question. I know what you've said is it's in there because of that, but.
Well, I think this was after discussion with those consent holders. They have some significant infrastructure in place that's based around their current allocation, which has gone through a consenting process. So rather than add some burden to them, which may compromise their investment and what have you, their takes have been allowed to continue, and they are within the current high flow allocation, which is 2 cubic metres a second. This is providing for additional high flow allocation to meet future needs.
And how does that impact or influence the over-allocation? I mean, it seems like everyone else here, and then we're going to maintain this for valid economic reasons, of course, but, you know, one rule for a group and another for another group. I'm trying to reconcile that.
Yeah, so this, I guess it's two different resources we're talking about. The over-allocation we talked about before was for the groundwater, where that paper allocation is very much higher than actual use, so that's being reduced. Then there's the run-of-river allocation for the Ngauruoro River, yes, which the tank group's decided is at its limit, and it has been for some time, and that's staying the same. This is a new allocation for high flows. So if you like, we don't regard it as being over-allocated at all, and there is capacity to add some more, which is where this policy's coming in.
So if we take the staff recommendation, we're not approving any particular storage scheme or any particular augmentation scheme.
I disagree.
We're simply saying that.
To do with the allocation of groundwater.
Excuse me. We're not approving any particular storage scheme or any particular augmentation scheme. We're simply saying that there is a margin of water at high flows that can be safely taken from the river without impacting recharge, for example, of the aquifer, because that's already provided for. So this is water that would not be otherwise utilized. And what the plan is doing is simply saying, all right, we're creating that resource, basically, to be available, subject to any further development or case being made at some point that X storage scheme or Y storage scheme or Z augmentation scheme makes sense. This is simply the reservoir, if you will, that water would need to come from at that point in time. So we're basically saying here's a banking system to be able to capture it when we need to in the safest possible manner. And then a later discussion at some point in the future after this plan change would be, okay, do we want to dam someplace, or do we want to, do a project of whatever kind? The case will have to be made separately for that to happen. Is that a question? Is that a correct interpretation of where we are?
That would be spot on.
Okay.
So the discussion around, well, because they've put a large investment in their current existing infrastructure, so that's why that clause B is there, is still a valid point or a moot point because of what Tom brought up?
It's somewhat moot. They were provided with the opportunity to take water for storage at high flows. The reassessment is changing the flow at which that water can be taken. Their operation has already gone through an assessment of effects and it's fine. What we're doing now is allowing for more high flow water but with a higher minimum flow to apply, just so we're raising the bar essentially in terms of when that water can be taken.
So those existing consents have been through the assessment process and considered that they're acceptable. We would have problems if we allocated a further 8 QMEX with their minimum flows. So what we've said is let's make these minimum flows higher again. And it's really important to remember that with a minimum flow of 20 QMEX, low flows aren't affected by this at all, because once the flow drops below 20 QMEX, all those high flow abstractions stop.
And does that include the current existing consented?
Oh, they have slightly lower minimum flows.
Slightly lower? How much slightly lower?
12. It's really complex consent. Like the main one, it's like a 5. They allowed so much at 5 QMEX, and then some more at 12 QMEX.
So if we were to take the view that what we're proposing here is we want to get everyone consistent across the board. So that suggests to me that we're quite happy to let these guys keep on doing until their consents come up for renewal, and then we're proposing to put them onto the regime like everyone else will be on?
No. We're providing for them to continue on the grounds that they've already got. Preferential treatment.
Yeah, until their consents come up for renewal.
No, that's not what the plan is providing for.
So this policy is applying to new takes, and so they will have existing use rights. They will be subject to policy, but the proposal...
Yeah, new takes will be, right?
Yeah, the rollovers will be subject to policy, but the policy that's not proposed is to substantially change that those existing consents.
Yeah, I understand we're not looking at retrospectively going back and changing anyone's consents, right?
But when they come up,
come up,
it's not proposed that those existing consents be substantially changed in the way that the policy is currently crafted.
Why? Why? I mean, we've got ourselves into a big bog of stench because we've got our allocation all over the place because we've done stuff willy-nilly. And people are it seems to me that people are on different rules all over the place.
Well, look, my understanding is that the tank group has not recommended clawing back the existing surface water takes to the extent that you are suggesting that they might. If somebody's got a consent now to take a certain volume at 5 QMEX, for example, they will have land use and infrastructure based on the flow regime that they can abstract. To lift that to 20 QMEX, you would effectively take away a substantial proportion of the time of the year in which they are currently able to take surface flows, and so you'd be fundamentally changing what it is that they can take.
But this is takes to storage. It's not takes for direct use, it's for takes for storage. So you're suggesting in one hand that 8 cubic metres a second at a cut-off point of 20 cubes, whatever it is, is going to be perfectly satisfactory for everyone else. But these guys who got in first have another particular set of rules underneath that.
So they will have built storage relative to the ability to abstract. And if you go from a 5 QMEC to a 20 QMEC point at which they can start taking, there's going to be a substantial proportion of the year, particularly during the summer drier months when they can't take, So they would need to be taking in the winter months and presumably having significantly more storage capacity to get the water when they need it in the summer months. Does that make sense?
That's beginning to make sense to me. The other thing I would make a comment on, James, is that this particular issue is one that's in contention, because that's why we've been asked to make a decision on it. Otherwise, why would it be in the paper for us to talk about? Okay, so at the end of the day, the tank may have had the discussion, but they've left it in our hands to deal with.
Yes.
That part was not under contention, the existing takes for storage. That part wasn't under contention. It was how do you provide for further takes to storage in a sustainable way. So this is a new limit, a new resource, as Councillor Belford said, that is available for storage, but at a slightly higher flow.
So the lack of consensus was on which of these options would be appropriate.
So I thought we were dealing with the contentious issues. So you're saying that what's in here isn't?
No, it is contentious. It was not agreed.
It was, how much extra?
It was not agreed, but nor is it contentious. We're being told that any number we pick here from 10 on down is a safe number to pick. The group had a show of hands and it was divided as to which of the 3 numbers to pick. That's what we're talking about here.
And what we're saying is not contentious, was not contended at least, was the current surface takes as being effectively rolled over. So there was not a decision by the tank group to claw back existing surface takes to reduce the impact on surface flows.
But it will be open to us to claw back if we need to.
It is, but it's not a recommendation of the tank group.
Yeah. And that's one of the issues that, we're meant to be regional leaders here, and we're not necessarily meant to pander to populist demands. We're meant to be doing the right thing in terms of sustainability. And we can plan as much as you like, but you can't mess around with nature, because if this global warming is going to end up the way it's supposed to be, all these plans may be for nothing. And I think that given that there's this new money out there, Provincial Growth Fund, we should be also exploring ways in which we can promote land use that requires less water.
Well, Mr. Chair, perhaps if we just focus on the issues as they arise, we can continue to go down a dozen rabbit holes, but the issue we've got in front of us is what is this group's position on this particular item, as opposed to any other items we want to introduce, which we can table later. So I think to progress this, and we've got a lot of them, we need to be very focused on the business at hand, as opposed to...
all I'm saying is we're operating in a paradigm.
Well, that's fine, but, we can have those...
And this is a real one.
Well, we can have those debates often and at another time, but let's focus in on the business at hand.
Can we
I agree.
get through the presentation, though? We've got a lot of slides, and the staff are here to give us information rather than us expressing opinions. Otherwise, it's going to be a very long day, and you'll probably lose your quorum after lunchtime.
Carry on. You will.
That's what we're here for, to express our opinions.
3 o'clock, Alan.
Just to explain...
Can we carry on with the staff's?
We can, yes.
Thank you.
But just to explain the line of questioning, anyway, from myself, Te Ao Māori, I know that you look at everything in a I call it a silo sort of a view. But when we're looking at this and listening to the presentation, I think of it as what are the ramifications around it? And so that's what my line of questioning is about. There's ramifications around each individual set of recommendations. So let's just explain that. So, haere tonu.
Okay. So in that vein, and trying not to be in a silo, we're moving now from a situation where it's been raining lots and there's lots of water and there's maybe some extra water that can be used for storage for use at dry times, to a situation where we're in the middle of summer and groundwater abstraction is being undertaken for a whole range of end users and is having an impact on stream flows and spring flows. And the issues that have been identified are that groundwater and surface water abstraction reduces the stream flows. We have groundwater depletion effects from those surface water depletion effects from groundwater takes. We're managing surface water takes through a combination of minimum flows and allocation limits, and also abstraction bans when those minimum flows are reached. For groundwater restrictions, though, if we restrict them at low flow, we found that it's not a very efficient or timely way of managing the stream flow effect. And we've also looked at reducing the amount of groundwater taken to see what happens to those stream flows. And that had very marginal environmental benefits depending on where you were in the Heretaunga Plains. The groundwater allocation exceeds actual use, and we've talked about that problem previously. If we increase groundwater abstraction, so continue to increase the amount of groundwater used, the modelling shows us that we will have further impacts on surface water flows and groundwater levels. That drives the need for a limit to be placed on the amount of groundwater abstracted. We also know that the lowland streams ecosystem health is reasonably poor, particularly because of low oxygen and or the large amount of macrophyte growth in those streams. So those streams aren't in a very good health, particularly in the summertime. There are a number of agreements around the tank table about how to deal with those issues, and we've talked about the allocation limit. That was a clear agreement that we do need to have a limit of groundwater abstraction, and it's been based as an interim on the 2012-2013 level of use. And the reallocation of that groundwater has got to be based on actual and reasonable use, and maybe in response to the concerns about sustainability, it's limited to use prior to 2017, which is when the council first made it quite clear to the community that we've reached the groundwater abstraction limit. So 2017 puts a line in the sand as to when water use is, actual and reasonable water use is defined. And we're preventing new water use, so quite strict rules in the plan that are linked to allocation limits that will prevent new water use. And we're looking at preventing the transfer of the unused portion as well, because we don't want some of that paper allocation to be used in the interim. The plan also looks at improving the way we manage our riparian land area, and we covered that in the workshop a couple of weeks ago, that we need to rethink about the way our riparian land is managed, and there are milestones in the plan that work towards better planting, better land management along those riparian margins, principally to provide shading for the macrophytes. So we reduce the amount of macrophyte, we increase the oxygen and lower the temperature. But it also provides much better ecosystem health, because you've got vegetation that provides for indigenous species. The tank group also agreed to further investigate the development of a storage and release option for managing the depletion impact on the Ngaruroro River. And the modelling, and if you want further detail, Jeff can explain, but the modelling showed that we can't use the same methodology of flow enhancement for the lowland streams as for the big river, because the quantities are just too great. So the solution for the impact on the Ngaruroro is a storage and release scheme that will mitigate those stream depletion effects. The other thing agreed to is that all of the existing permits need to be reviewed and water reallocated on that actual and reasonable basis, and that once all of this work is done, that the package or the outcome is reviewed within 10 years or at 10 years, so that we look at the allocations, we look at the allocation limit, look at the actual water use data, and have a much clearer idea about what the actual and reasonable water use is in relation to the outcomes we're looking for those for that stream health. And so the option in front of you really is, do we adopt the stream depletion provisions, which are currently provided through Policy 35, or not. The rest of the solutions were agreed to by the tank group, and there's a bigger list in the papers in front of you. But what they weren't in agreement was whether or not the stream depletion provisions should be adopted as a mitigation measure for those stream depletion effects.
What component, Marianne, did they not agree? You had several.
There was a range of concerns around the flow augmentation. There was still a feeling that maybe reducing the allocations should be the first step. And there were also a number of concerns about whether or not the flow enhancement scheme would be as successful at Twyford as it would possibly be in some of the other streams where it's needed. So a bit of an uncertainty around how successful the methodology would be.
Is it possible that that augmentation could be delivered within the allocation limit of 90 million?
That was actually a subject of some debate, and the irrigators, well, the modelling was based on the actual and reasonable use plus an additional amount for the stream flow enhancement. But in trying to work through, a compromise or a consensus, the irrigator said, well, actually we could probably provide for the stream flow enhancement within our allocations. So they're saying they will do it within the 90 million, not plus extra enhancement flow.
Which was the experience with the Twyford.
Because they got the global consent.
Yeah.
They would look at it globally.
Yeah, and in that case, even within their allocation plus the augmentation, I think they've never gone above 40% of their total allowable.
47.
47, is it?
But don't forget, we're going in the reallocation of water. There's an actual and reasonable assessment,
Yep.
so that buffer will be reduced.
Would come down, yeah.
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 But that drives or is an incentive for them to work collectively with the
Still think
available
they can
water.
do it. They still think they can do it, eh?
Yeah.
What, I'm just curious, the Tangata Whenua members of TANK, what were their contentious issues?
One was...
Were they?
Well, the reasons for their disagreement with agreeing to this as a mitigation measure appeared to be around favouring a reduction in allocations and around the uncertainty of the effectiveness of this particular scheme.
Look, I'd just make the comment that I think at a gut level for most people, it just seems safer to take water away from existing users and give it to the environment rather than using more resource to mitigate or offset the environmental effects of the existing use. So using more resource to solve an environmental effect, I think at a gut level, can be a little bit challenging. And obviously there's a bit of proof in the pudding. And so people are saying, well, can we really sure we'll get the benefits here? We know that if we take water off people and reduce, then it's going to be in the environment, so you get a very direct cause and effect, even though
I dispute that, James. We're not certain about that.
Well,
we're not certain that if you take half their water away, you're going to get any improvement in the streams.
So the advice is that you'll need to take an awful lot to get a material effect, but there is a reasonably direct cause and effect relationship as opposed to probably some more of the uncertainties around augmentation. So this is about grappling with uncertainty, and it's about the cost benefit and about how much pain you want to inflict on the community to manage your own concerns around risk and uncertainty as a decision maker.
Kia ora, James. I just asked those questions because, as was said around the current existing water users, Māori have put hundreds of years of investment in the infrastructure of the Ngaruroro, of the rivers and the waterways. So I think their indecision is valid and they need to be considered that because there has been a long-term investment placed in that by Māori. So I understand their indecision and I'm still trying to grapple with what's in front of us.
Thank you, Chair. What I'm having struggled grappling with is you're pumping out the groundwater, which is depleting the streams, and you're going to look at mitigating that by pumping more groundwater out and putting that back in the streams again. I'm a little bit. It sort of defies logic a wee bit. So I wouldn't mind having that simplified, a simple explanation for me.
Yeah, that is a really good question, and that is something that took the tank group not a long time, but some time to get their heads around. If the problem's caused by pumping, how is more pumping going to resolve the problem? And it's all about timing. So these augmentation abstractions are for a relatively short time. There is a delay from the pumping that causes those stream depletion effects, and the stream depletion effect is a percentage of the abstraction. So you're managing the timing, pumping that water straight into the stream, and the effect takes a little longer to be observed.
I'm sorry, it's a pity the whiteboard's not here because I'd like that to be demonstrated to me visually. I find that really difficult to follow.
I anticipated this would be something we'd workshop on next week, to be fair.
Just to perhaps help out a little bit more, Paul, so the scenario which seems counterintuitive here, would be right if you were doing the augmentation all year round. So if you were taking from groundwater to mitigate the effect all year round, if the effect that you were trying to mitigate indeed was there all year round, and it's not, it's actually there for a short period of time, then you would be depleting the very resource that you're trying to protect the effect of its depletion from. So it is because we're talking about a relatively short period of time. Similar to the Ongatiko issue that you looked at recently, the issue in terms of the depressurisation of the springs is coming from the overall groundwater level affected by all of the takes. And so spatially specific areas for short periods of time, you can effectively get away with taking a bit more resource, so you'd have a relatively minor effect on the overall water level across the aquifer for a really significant benefit in terms of putting quite a lot of water into a stream for a short period of time.
So will the stored, so you're talking about taking this and storing it?
No, we're talking about groundwater straight to stream.
Straight to stream.
Actually, Councillor Bailey, there is one or two places where the modelling showed it won't work for that very reason that you said. One is a Paritua Karewarewa stream. Because that stream's so leaky, you can pump water in and it disappears straight away, so you're not getting the benefit of that time lag. And we worked with the Mana Whenua group, now called Treaty Partners Group, on that issue, and we didn't have time within this tank planning process to come up with a really robust solution for that. So we asked whether the Treaty Partners Group would accept that we put into the plan provision to investigate fully the best solution rather than rushing into something that might work. And it was one of the best meetings I've been to. I felt the trust that they placed in us to do that was incredible. And it's found its way into the plan as Policy 55, I think it is in this version, where we're committing to investigate stream bed restoration, augmentation, managed aquifer recharge, and any other solutions that might be part of a package for that special place. And
where's that stream?
Paritua, near Bridge Park.
Oh, in Bridge Park.
Yeah.
That one.
Yeah.
So Pārtai, is the Treaty Partners Group different to the Tangata Whenua Tank Group?
It is.
It's the same.
Yeah, they were a working group that was set aside.
So they're the same people though, right?
Yes.
The same people that have the indecision.
Yes.
But are agreeing to work following this through.
I'd just like to make a comment that, just remind people, this RPC committee exists so that Tangata Whenua can have their say about their opinions, and although scientists and staff may have a presentation, we should be able to bring our opinions to the table.
Oh, sure.
And one of the opinions I raised was we need to be encouraging people to use the land in a different way with less water. Now, Māori in the past, according to Captain Cook, we were great agriculturalists. And we didn't use water. What we did, we had technology where we put stones in with our kumaras and all the rest of it, and that created a natural, transpiration process or whatever, and it watered the plants. So there are things like avocados that don't need a lot of water as well. So we need to be encouraging people who have got an expectation that they can abuse the environment, that they need to be looking at other options.
Yeah, I would just like, Chair, with your opinion, I'd just like to endorse that. I've been very strong on this. We have the Hiratonga, this is about Hiratonga really, this plan change, and we definitely have some crops that use less water and some growers who are very efficient, and I think as technology grows, we're going to get even more efficient at using water. So we definitely do not want to encourage crops on the Hiratonga Plains that excessively use water. Like, for instance, we wouldn't want a dairy farm on the Hiratonga Plains. So we do need to get a bit stroppy about this.
Mr. Chair, both our co-chairs are diving down. We've got a business at hand. If you want to make political statements, I suggest you get a soapbox outside.
No. You're using your formalism against my culture.
With respect, Mr. Chair,
I'm here as a result of a
Mr. Chair, you're here
Parliament.
to deal with this issue. Let's get on with it.
I'm getting a bit frustrated. I'm just about ready to go home.
Mr. Chair.
There's freedom of speech at this forum.
There's work to do as well.
Well,
Mr. Chair, can
only if your views are more important than others. We all have a right to express our point of view. So carry on.
We'll come on once I start talking. So, Mr. Chair, if I may, 2 questions. First one to Cherie. How far are we into your presentation at the moment? Marianne, sorry.
That's all right. This is the end of the stream depletion.
And then we have 2 other recommendations to go through.
One more set, or actually 1A and 1B, around the minimum flows.
Okay. So I'm quite keen, as Councillor Hewitt has mentioned, to hear the end of the presentation, but I would like to foreshadow at the risk of bearing the wrath of some of our council colleagues, I would like to foreshadow an amendment to the resolution based on how the conversation is evolving today. I'll make that clear later on after the presentation.
After lunch.
So moving on to the third issue, where there was some a lack of real consensus around the final wording, the minimum flows and allocation limits for the 2 main rivers, the Ngāroro and the Tutaikuri. And the issue essentially is whether the existing minimum flows and allocation limits that are currently in the resource management plan are appropriate to protect the identified values of those 2 rivers. And the agreements that the group came to were around the acknowledgement that groundwater abstraction in the Hiratonga Plains has a stream depletion effect on the Ngāroro River, and that a storage and flow release option is going to be looked at for that particular effect, and that groundwater abstraction in the Zone 1 part of the system, which is the Zone 1 is where it's a groundwater abstraction, but the effect is more or less instantaneous on the river. So groundwater takes in Zone 1 are being considered as surface water abstractions within the surface water allocation limit. And that there are allocation limits and minimum flow triggers that are in the rules, and that's different than what is currently in the plan, because those provisions are currently in policy and are providing guidance but not real limits to decision making. So the plan change is more directive in terms of those allocation limits, and that we are going to phase out over allocation and prevent further over allocation. And there are a range of agreements around improving ecosystem health. That includes things like the stock exclusion and the addressing of sediment loss in the catchment, and things like improving the water quality to the states or the attribute states that have been agreed to. And as I mentioned, agreement around damming prohibitions. In relation to the Nararura River options for minimum flow and allocation limits, the group eventually narrowed down the level of disagreement to more or less A and B, being the two bookends of where they landed. So the option A was around maintaining the current minimum flow, but with reducing the allocation limit downwards to 1,300 rather than 1,581. Option B was looking at increasing the minimum flow in stages over the next few years to 2035 to 3,600 litres a second, with a decision to be made around how we deal with the allocation limit in those in that case. So whether or not we prorata the allocation limits stepwise and consistent with when the minimum flow changes, or just have a sinking lid approach, as it were, to reducing allocations. But those people taking water under option B would have a much lower security of supply, which would get increasingly worse as each minimum flow trigger is changed. This is surface water at low flow.
Worth just mentioning emergency water too.
Oh, and that was an option that we at least modelled to see what would happen, but there was no decision around what would happen if water permit users were allowed to continue taking 10% of their allocated amount. And previous conversations talked about that as being tree survival water, that kind of provision. But this is a little more generic and would allow any permit holder to continue with 10%. So that would offset slightly the impact of the minimum flow increases.
So there's no provision for tree survival or crop survival water in option A?
No. No, because we're not changing the security of supply.
No, but I mean, you're still going to, you can't control the weather. You're still going to go under minimum flows in times of extreme drought.
That's right.
So when that happens, too bad.
Yeah, and so, Councillor, the report attached does use the term trigger flows, and trigger flows is probably a better term because it's the trigger for an irrigation ban. It's not the level at which the river is managed at. So it is important for the committee to understand that the river in dry times will continue to drop below that level. So you're not guaranteeing that at 2,400 or at 3,500 that's where the river will get to and stay at.
So if the science is saying there's very little benefit to be gained from an irrigation ban, why are we doing it?
This is more around managing surface water abstraction. The science is saying a ban on the groundwater takes has little effect on stream flow recovery, but if you've got a surface take, a ban would improve the surface flow by the amount that's being taken.
So this is in relation to surface.
Yeah, it would.
Okay, just so it's clear in my head, the flows that you're talking about, when I go back to figure 1 on page 16, that's the ones right at the very, that's the first lot of environmental flows?
Yeah, the low flows.
Low flows, right?
Low
Okay,
flows,
that's
yeah.
all good. On page 28, you've got the table there with option A, option B, down to allocation limit. You've got in brackets there, existing allocation is now over 3,000 litres per second because of new accounting for Zone 1 groundwater takes. That didn't seem to relate to anything else that was in the paper. Or was that just a typo, or?
The Zone 1 groundwater takes were previously not part of a surface allocation limit. They were considered as groundwater takes, but because of their almost immediate impact on surface flows, we've calculated the surface take as including those Zone 1 takes.
So those zones...
This policy applies to the Zone 1.
Yeah.
Whatever that is.
Groundwater takes.
Whatever that is, right? Because you've talked about, and you talked about it in the last section too, about fair and actual and reasonable use.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean in reality, or just a bit of a definition on that?
Yeah, well, that was actually the subject of quite a lot of analysis, I suppose, is what do we mean by actual and reasonable? And with the assistance of the TANK members, we do have a definition for actual and reasonable, and it is in the draft version 7.
Yeah.
But essentially, it says that actual and reasonable is no more than the quantity that they've already got on any permit due for renewal, so they're not going to get any more as a basis. And then it's the least of either their water meter records up to 2017 if you're a groundwater, or up to the point of application,
Chairman shall.
or the amount that's modelled as being necessary for the crop being irrigated using Irricalc.
So it's the lesser of those.
The lesser of those, but there are some discretions built in that account for the effects of water sharing arrangements, the effect of crop rotation or development phase,
Yep.
so we can take into account the circumstances of actual and reasonable where we need to.
Okay. One further question. When we look at the table for the Tūtai, I know we're talking about the Ngāruaro here. When we talk about looking at the table for the Tūtai Kuri, you have reasons for supporting and costs and risks associated. You've got in one part of the table does not reflect Kaititanga, aspirations of mana whenua. Yet that doesn't seem to be reflected in the reasons for supporting all costs and risks in the Ngāruaro analysis.
Yeah, it's a good point, and it's an omission on my part because it would fit in both of the reasons supporting for both rivers.
It fits in the supporting both rivers.
Yeah.
Because you've got it in as a cost and risk in the Tūtai Kuri analysis.
Yeah, but it should also be for the Ngāruaro.
It's a cost and risk, or is it a reason to support?
A reason to support. No, that would be a reason to support option B for the Ngāruaro.
Because it does not reflect Kaitihanga. I'll get corrected, I'm sure about that. Aspirations of mana whenua, because it
would depend how it's a double negative, so it would be a reason to support option B for the Ngāruaro, the fact that it would support or it would reflect Kaitiaki Tanga aspirations.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that.
Okay. You done? Questions? Carry on.
Nothing further to present, Chair. So at the Tūtai Kuri.
Yeah.
Tūtai Kuri.
So Tūtai Kuri. So the staff recommendation is option A for the Ngāruaro, and moving on to the Tūtai Kuri. There were 3 options considered by the TANK group. One was the have the minimum flow remain at 2,000 with a target allocation limit of 1,140, which is slightly less. Option B was to increase the minimum flow to 2,500 and also drop the allocation limit. And the third option was to increase in stages to 3,200 by 2030. And the same issue around what the allocation limit would look like under option C applies here. The dropping of the allocation limit to 1,140 is not as contentious in the Tūtai Kuri because we have some unallocated water in the Tūtai Kuri. So this just reflects the bit that hasn't been allocated yet. So it would be a fully allocated river. There wouldn't be any other water available for abstraction under options A and B, and would be over-allocated under option C. So the 3 options there very well. The staff recommendation is option B. So that's to increase the minimum flow, and the modelling did show that the impact of that on security of supply for the users would be negligible or minor, and also to decrease the allocation limit to reflect the existing allocation.
So effectively protecting the tūtākuri from any further abstraction.
Yep.
Double positive.
If they go with B.
So you're all done, Marianne?
I'm all done.
So, Chair, that's the presentation and staff advice on the 4 substantive matters and the recommendations. So we could either break for lunch or we could move to voting on those unless there's further questions from the
It'll
committee.
take a while to vote.
Well, I don't think lunch is till 1.
Which is at 1, okay.
So it's probably wise that we proceed.
So probably, Chair, if there are any further questions, we should have those now before moving to the...
So I have a question, Chair. So the Tangata Whenua members of this committee met yesterday with their advisors, and we have no idea what advice was received, and I'd like, if we could, as part of our proceedings today, to hear a summary of that.
You've been hearing that, Councillor Bevan, all through this meeting. The advice, the discussions, our opinions.
Well,
We've
yeah,
heard
okay,
some questions,
but
so-
we're all members of the same committee. We should all sort of receive the same advice. So I'd like to understand and hear what that is.
Chair, if the committee was of a mind to, I do note that Mr Tiuka's here, who's was intimately involved in advancing the arguments for some of the options here, and no doubt Mr Allison as well as the advisor to Tangata Whenua reps would both be in a position presumably to come up and present the case for the alternatives that are before the committee.
What now?
Yeah.
I would have thought we would put it in the planned approach as opposed to now. It's a new agenda item, isn't it?
No, well, it's further advice on the items we've been discussing. You've had an opportunity to question staff in terms of our advice, and so we have certainly at least one other advisor paid by council who presumably can also answer questions in terms of the advice that he's proffering.
If I might, Mr Chair, thank you, James, for that suggestion, and I'm not going to speak on behalf of our 2 visitors in the gallery, but just with regards to Councillor Bevan's question around what information was provided to the Tangata Whenua reps, which has led to the amendment of the recommendation from which I foreshadowed earlier on. So, with regards to advice from advisors, all we did was go through the agenda items and talk about nothing terribly great in detail. The majority of our focus was on the tank plan, with the scraps left around the remaining items on the agenda, and that was just because of time priorities. So we tried with some effort to gain an understanding of the 6 years of work which is in this plan. And as has been mentioned by other councillors and staff, it is quite a complex plan change. So with your permission, Mr Chair, I'd like to foreshadow I realise that the motion hasn't as yet been put to the table, but with your permission, I'd like to put forward an amendment to the resolution. We're quite happy. After our conversations yesterday, what was quite clear by the end of it was the size and the scale of the science and work that we need to get a better understanding of in order to validate and do justice by the work which has been done by the collective stakeholder members of the TANK group. So we are cognizant of some of the non-consensus issues, but we're also aware that we would like to have a better grasp of this plan change before we move to decision-making items.
Prior to you doing that, I'd just like to answer Councillor Bevan's question.
You're the chair.
The terms of reference state that the advisors are advisors to the Tangata Whenua, and until that changes, it will not be, well...
There's also a council resolution that says all and any advice that's funded by this council will be shared by all members of this committee, Chair.
And when that's communicated to us, we will abide by it.
Has that not yet been communicated?
was communicated to the advisors, and then I subsequently received a email from the Tangata Whenua chair and co-chair indicating that they were aware of the council resolutions.
So you've received the advice, Chair? You must have.
And our discussion is that they are, you have, the council has in-committee meetings where we are not privy to, and we have our discussions, which we need to delve into the issues that concern us.
That's not correct, Chair. The only time we've ever had a meeting...
We had one this morning.
We had it. We're not to discuss this matter. It's not correct at all. The only time we've ever had a meeting without the Tangata Whenua members of the RPC being present is to discuss the terms of reference. That's the only time we ever have. So it's not correct.
Mr. Chairman, RP was in the middle of proposing something, and you didn't finish off. You didn't get the chance to finish off, did you?
Thank you very much.
It was just a question from Councillor Bevan.
I'd like to hear what the RP has to say.
We can get to that, yes.
So, with your permission, Mr. Chair, thank you. Thank you very much, Councillor Dick. So, even the evolving conversations that we've had throughout the course of this morning have indicated that there needs to be a better understanding across this entire table around the complexities of this plan change. So rather than doing a line-by-line process, which not only is frustrating but is a misinvestment of all of our time, the Tangata Whenua reps would like to propose an amendment to the motion, recommended that we stick with recommendation 1, which is to receive and note the tank plan change further information as is on page 32. What's on the screen at the moment? My amendments, just checking. Thank you. So the Tangata Whenua reps would like to put to the table that the Regional Planning Committee further notes that 2.1, that the tank plan change further information report is lengthy and contains complex information which requires further time for review and analysis by the committee members. 2.2, there are further reports to be provided, and staff including, but not limited to, Plan Change 9 implementation plan, mandatory pre-notification requirements, timeframes and arrangements for Plan Change 9 hearings, as well as the Section 32 evaluation report, and also including any further reports or information requested by anyone at this table, but specifically by the Tangata Whenua or council members in accordance with Resolution 3 of RPC 30/8. And just for reference, I think we've got that down here. 30/8 RPC meeting refers to the request of reports and the process by which that follows. There is mention of that in the paper in the earlier parts. And 2.3, the committee members will then assess and make a decision on the draft plan and accompanying documentation in its totality once all reports and information have been received. So in essence, after a lengthy conversation, and we had a lot of the same conversations we're having here today, seeking advice from advisors around how we could better understand this information. We are waiting on some critical reports, and we did get a response from our staff today with regards to some of those reports will take time to get together. In most cases, however, we are asking for pre-furnished reports provided to the tank group, which were used to help inform their decision and reasoning. So we would like an opportunity for those pre-existing reports to be made available. But this essentially was around providing a structured regime of workshop and discussion opportunities for us to be able to get a better grasp of the complexity of this plan change, so that we're not doing it at 1,000 cuts here at this table. So that's the motion that I'd like to put forward for discussion and consideration, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Any discussion?
You need a
seconder.
Mr. Chair,
Second over there, Rich.
Who moved it?
Tapani, and seconded by Machu.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chair, speaking to the motion, there's 130 pages for our meeting today. I received mine yesterday at 10 o'clock, on Monday at 10 o'clock. So Monday night I spare time. I did get through about 60 pages. So that's all I'll say just now. Thank you.
Any other?
Speaking to the motion, I too, like Pete, got the hard copy after I prompted people. I thought I had to request for them. My challenges are grappling with piecemeal sorts of approaches to this plan change. I know it's really large, and I like to think of things in context. So I'd like to see the whole thing, actually, so I can understand the reverberation across the tank plan of the different decisions. So I find it really challenging, one, to get the information late, which seems to be a common theme since I've been here anyway. And two, I'd like to see the whole plan change. I know it's a big deal, and I know that, you know, it's a large one. And looking at things like this and then wait a month and then do another, it doesn't help me figure out how to do proper due diligence to it and to give good decisions. So, and then I do note that we're having 2 workshops at the end of this month on the tank plan change. So it's just not adding up to me. I mean, you make decisions, then you do the workshop. I don't quite know how it works. So that's why I'm in support of the plan change. It's a big plan change. I'd like to give it the due diligence it's worth. And I'd like the time to afford it to be able to do that.
Chair, can I just clarify, the full plan change was provided prior to the last 2-day workshop, and the 2-day workshop went from cover to cover, the start of the plan to the end of the plan, and covered all of the issues. What we're going back on is those areas of non-consensus, where we're drilling down further. So just to be clear, that's what those 2 days was all about. If we have to repeat it, then we repeat it.
In response to that, Chair, doing it round that way, I mean, I'm sitting here and I'm kind of the opinion we've now delved into the contentious issues. You know, I'm lucky I got the papers on Friday, I think it was. And I'm struggling to work out how it ties into the plan change together as a whole, because you know the effects of setting a particular policy here has consequences throughout the rest of the plan, and I would like to see how that all ties in together, and where all those interrelationships happen, because that's a challenge we had with the way that we did this, the way we did this with having workshops on the plan change as a whole, which was useful. But then trying to go back and now have to go back from 2 weeks ago and try to tie in what's happened with these contentious issues is a bit of a challenge.
Kia ora, I'm speaking for the motion. One of the issues we have is, mana ahuriri, is that I'm the rep and sometimes I'm not here, but we don't get our mail every day like the rest of you, and I got mine on Monday as well. But in saying that, I had to flip through the 130-something pages to get a grip of things, but I did refer to the plan that we got in August last month. But my issue is that the plan seems somewhat unfinished, and I suppose I was under the assumption that when it hits our table, it's in completion. But obviously, it's not done that with this particular plan. The other thing is that as tangata whenua, we're running around trying to get our heads around this, at the same time trying to finish off the unconsensus bits and things. And now I have an issue with that, because if we're starting to do that, then how can we effectively make a decision on agreeing with the plan or not? Because then we're in a conflict, because we've actually developed the plan instead of agreeing on whether it meets the requirements of the RMA or not. So, in speaking for the motion, I believe there needs to be an opportunity for us as tangata whenua to actually have more time to come to terms with a plan that is in bits and pieces, and that's how I see it, it's in bits and pieces. It's not complete, it's incomplete. So unless I see a complete plan, we too can't make a decision to tick off or agree to recommendations that have been putting up for sign-off. And I agree with Jenny, there's 2 workshops after this meeting. So what is the rush with some of this pushing of the agreements being done now?
Chair, sorry, just if I could respond to that. There is a bit of chicken and egg in this, and part of it is, so note in the motion that's gone up there, the Section 32 analysis, which is a really important cost-benefit analysis that you need to consider as part of your decision-making, can't be completed until we know what the cost benefits that we are considering, because there's outstanding policy matters of which we're trying to get some guidance here. And obviously minimum flows are a really significant one in terms of their social and economic costs. You've been provided with some reports which have looked at the options and looked at the impacts on that, but you won't get a final Section 32 analysis until you've finalised the plan. And so there are some outstanding matters that we need some guidance on. So what we'll probably need to do is somehow do a Section 32 analysis that's got some options, if you like, in it, if we're not going to get resolution on preference on some of these points prior to completing that.
Okay, any other questions?
So sorry, Jane, so taken from that suggestion that in that motion, it's the Section 32 evaluation report is the one that you're really concerned about in terms of meeting time, the flow of information coming in so we can make a decision.
Yeah.
A lot of the Section 32 report is actually in the material in front of you. Those supporting documents give you the options, they give you the costs and the benefits. They have the information that is just going to be repackaged differently in the Section 32. And we can't finish the Section 32 until we know what the decision is, so that we can assess the costs in relation to the decision that you've made. So Section 32 comes after or alongside the decision making. It's not something that will help you decide until you've looked at the options that are in front of you.
Mr. Chair, can I ask, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Can I ask a question of staff in terms of the proposed motion 2.2, and there's been discussion on Section 32 evaluation, but there's other matters there. For example, Plan Change 9 implementation plan, mandatory pre-notification requirements, timeframes arrangement for Plan Change 9 hearings, as well as Section 32 evaluation report. We've heard some examination of the Section 32 evaluation report. Are there comments also on those other aspects of the proposed recommendation?
There's a discussion document in preparation around the nutrient management aspects.
So I'm just going up to the board. So we've got Plan Change 9 implementation plan.
It's been provided, hasn't it?
You've got a...
So that's been provided, hasn't it?
A draft,
yes,
yeah.
Okay. Mandatory pre-notification requirements.
We haven't reported on that. We still need to prepare some options for you and some timeframes.
And is that critical to the decision-making today?
You would probably decide once you've gone through your decision-making process as
to... And then going to timeframes and arrangements for Plan Change 9 hearings.
That's somewhat contingent on the decisions you make about pre-notification process, and also about the timetable this committee takes.
That's right.
To arrive at proposing a plan.
Sure. So in looking at the recommendation on the board, there are a number of timing issues to do with which are a consequence of decisions made, as opposed to prerequisites for decision. Would that be a fair comment from me? So I'm really asking a question. Clearly, the 2-day workshop, which examined the entire document, was insufficient for Tangata Whenua members to come to grips with the plan. Because now we're moving on to subsequent workshops and discussion of details in the plan. So is it worth repeating the 2-day workshop for the whole plan and also having workshops on the detail of what's being requested here by the contentious issues? Is that essentially what we need to do, is to repeat?
So I think we do need some guidance about what is it that's still not clear or what the concerns are about what's proposed that we can provide some further advice on. Look, at one level, nothing's agreed to everything's agreed, because at some point this committee will decide to adopt and notify the plan in totality. The thing we're trying to wrestle with here is we're trying to wrestle to the ground a beast that's got some disagreement around some of the matters, and before we can get to a point where you can decide that the whole package is agreed, we actually have to narrow the shape of it, and that's what we're trying to do iteratively here. And so we run the risk of this kind of chicken and egg situation of not getting decisions on those final parameters, so we never get to present a final plan change, because we're also here and want to see the whole final plan change.
I wonder, Mr Chair, with your indulgence, I wonder whether it's worth actually mapping out. It occurs to me that Tangawhenua members have significant difficulty, and I totally appreciate that, in terms of there appears to be a belief that by giving direction, a recommendation, and that's what it is, only a recommendation to staff, for example, around specific issues of contention, that's the end of the matter. And I think that needs to be clear, that there will be checkpoints all the way along the continuum where the bigger issues can be argued and debated and contended. But at some point, we do need to go down and come to some degree of consensus about the detail in order for staff to get on and produce the plan. So it go back to that chicken and egg, and I guess it's each one of us getting our heads around the fact we are in a plan development and implementation process, and that does require consensus on the way through before you get to the end. And I just wondered whether, for example, to me it's blatantly obvious that the maximum flow issues are a protection for rivers. They don't take it away. So in isolation, they're decisions that ought to be made with some certainty that they are not harming the river, and therefore they can be made in that context. Ultimately, though, we come back to this being tabled again for global consideration. It's not the end of the matter.
So just to progress matters, can we deal with recommendation 1? I think that would be an easy one to get. At least we'll get rid of that, and then these other aspects are going to take a bit more dialogue and discussion, which we can do after lunch, which is.
Sorry, Chair. So can I just ask the mover? Is this motion in substitution of the staff recommendation, or is it in addition? Because I think there's a way you could read it that it could be both. But I'm assuming that this is a alternate recommendation, and the staff recommendations fall away.
Yes.
Yes.
So, Chair, just on that basis, before you move to, if you will indulge me, perhaps it's a question through you to the Chief Executive, because, and call me old-fashioned, whatever you like, but because we deviated from process here and we didn't actually put in second the original motion and then put an amendment to it, this now becomes substantive. If this fails now, what is the consequence of that, Chief Executive?
We'd be going back to the original motions.
If someone moves
If somebody moves them, that's right.
Okay, that's fine. As long as that's clear. Okay.
So where is the original, what page?
32.
Mr Chairman, I don't think this resolution requires much discussion. I think it actually should be put, because if it's carried, it puts things on the back burner subject to the provision of extra information, so on. If it fails, then it's open for us to move ahead with the staff recommendations, which generally I would have supported. But we need to test the meeting on this resolution.
Chair, I'd just like to speak to the motion, please. As the seconder. Firstly, just to provide some rationale with regard to our thinking around this whole kaupapa. First of all, you know, we want the same outcomes. That's in the best interest of all. That's not disputed here. I suppose my kōrero is really about addressing the elephant in the room that's impacting on us to actually get a consensus of agreements, because what I'm talking about is something that's bigger than the plan change. It's going to come up on any kaupapa that we put on the table, and that's about our cultural awareness and understanding with regard to our treaty relationship as we see it through the eyes of Te Ao Māori, Matauranga Māori, which is our old cultural values, kawa, tikanga, cultural principles. These are inherent in us that have been ingrained over centuries. So therefore, what's important, and that through my observations of what's been happening, is cultural unawareness of how we as the tangata whenua see things through a Māori lens. You know, when we read these things, we see it through a Māori lens. When we hear the kōrero people talk, we hear it through a Māori lens. When we speak through a Māori lens. And so therefore, until you actually understand where we're coming from and the rationales we put behind the decisions we make as kaitiaki or guardians, you know, it's inherent in us that we are caretakers of the land. Likewise, the responsibilities of the Hawkesbury Regional Council, that's ingrained in us for centuries, and that's always the fundamental part where we come from. We'll always take the responsible part and look at things like that with regard to the impact on the environment first and foremost, and therefore if we have to balance it out with economics and all that, then the checks and balances have to be right. And so it's taking a responsible approach on our part to be able to be in a position to make an informed decision. And just because we can't agree on a lot of these things here, that's because we're not in that space yet for us to understand it through our lens as we see it. And so, you know, there's no disconnect with regard to our outcomes, what we want to achieve together. That's not the issue here. But until we understand each other and get that understanding from how do you truly give effect to a treaty partnership, which is, this is what this is, then until you understand what that means, no matter what the issue comes up, if you don't understand how we look at things, there's always going to be that impact there on differences, and if we don't understand why those differences are there, you know, this is always going to come up. So, you know, that's what I just want to address, that with regard to understanding from our perspective, is that we see things through a cultural lens, and we don't oppose different things or say different things, go against the recommendations because we're different to you. We're the same as you, just that we got responsibilities to our constituencies, our outcomes that we desire also for the wider community, so it's a win-win for everyone. The checks and balances are there, so that's all I wanted to speak to the motion, Chair. Kia ora.
Thank you. Yes. Okay.
Mr. Neil wants to speak.
Mr. Chair, in speaking to the recommendation, I'm cognizant of the advice from staff, in my view, in taking on a very good kōrero from my colleague, from a tangata whenua colleague. I think both sets of recommendations are mutually compatible, and it would be a shame to lose one and the other. And I'm going to ask the mover and seconder if they would consider moving all the recommendations as one, because they are so interconnected. You need more information and reports, that's fine, but it doesn't preclude decision-making around those particular items, because that will be reported back to you anyway, and ultimately you have the opportunity to accept or not accept at a further point. So I'm suggesting that they are mutually compatible, and I wonder whether you'd consider, mover and seconder, taking them as a whole.
Thank you, Councillor Curtin. Given the advice given to from the staff that the amendment to the motion was put forward because I could see us delving into some detail in the conversation. So normally I would have waited for the original motion to be put forward first and then suggested the amendment afterward, which is the normal process. But given that I have opened my waha prior to that and I've now put the amendment before the substantive motion, we're at risk, based on staff advice, of actually losing both motions. So in light of that, and wanting to make sure we continue to move forward, and that there is alignment between both motions on the table, and that the expression of the tangata whenua is around ensuring that we get good understanding and perception in these spaces, I'd be quite happy for those two motions to be combined together. What that might look like, I'll wait for advice and discussion around the table, and I'll refer now to the seconder if they're happy with that position.
Kia ora, Chair. As a matter of moving forward, and I thank Councillor Curtin for your comments, and I think that is a big step forward, how we can move forward together, and that's exactly the kind of what I would like to see, how we can respect each other's things, so I accept.
So we're looking at both motions combined.
Can I just ask for James' comment on that? Is that practical?
Well, look, if Mr Tapani wants to modify his motion to include those existing ones, then yes, that is practical. I mean, obviously we'll still need to get agreement on those matters included in the existing staff recommendations, but assuming that we do, then they are agreed for the purposes of, and I draw your attention to, sorry, only if you just go back up, it is into the draft, so it's still the draft plan change, and it's version 8, so it's the next version. So this is, you're not agreeing to these to be adopted in the plan for notification at this point. We're not at that point.
Changing my peak.
Put the motion, Chair. I reckon we're ready.
Take it down a bit, let's see the end of it.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Now we're in the dark.
They can coexist.
Can I speak to the motion, Todd?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's an amicable solution, but can we, I mean, there seems to be a recurring theme with the papers being received by people at a late stage. I'm not entirely sure what the solution is, but it seems to be something that's happening over and over again. I mean, it took until I suggested to staff that they just put stuff in my Dropbox in the councillors' room here that I've started getting papers at a reasonable time frame. I know that's not a fault of staff, it's probably a fault of the people that are delivering things, but it's certainly, in terms of making good decisions, it makes it really challenging if you get the papers on a Monday for a Wednesday meeting.
Well, they are all finalised and completed on the Thursday and issued on the Thursday afternoon. And if they're going by post, then there's a good chance they might not, I guess, get there till Monday. That is a bit of a challenge. And couriers are an option for us, obviously, for those that live close. Those that live rurally or far-flung, it's a bit more of a challenge. I know that it's not ideal for everybody, but electronic gets around this, and we issue them electronically on Thursday, and so they are available at that point in time. And for those that wish to use a device to view this, you've at least got a guarantee that they're going to arrive plenty of time prior to the meeting.
In this instance, and I'd be interested in some feedback because I know not everyone loves Dropbox. I don't. We issued these under a PDF, but it was a massive PDF. It doesn't take away the size and complexity of not reading it. But
Councillor Belford.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to vote for this resolution as a pretend resolution. It really doesn't solve anything much in my judgment, but I'd like to get a better grip on what exactly is the process that will satisfy everyone in terms of moving forward from here. We had a 2-day workshop, which I thought presented all of the issues comprehensively, but clearly that wasn't enough. What's enough? I'm very unclear as to whether we are talking about, what, another month, another 6 months, another year? What are we talking about here? Where does this go from this meeting?
Well, I think where it goes is that as governors, we all have a responsibility to understand in depth the issues, to be able to make good decisions on behalf of the community. So that's where it goes.
Well, and how long is that going to take, Mr. Chairman?
I don't know. A lot of it comes down to timely information, timely periods for people to get to understand the information, and yeah.
Mr. Chair, if I could just perhaps make a comment about the upcoming workshops. We are not entirely clear what to provide for those, because we did go through the plan end to end. We've got some residual issues which have been the subject of today's meeting. There are still a few reports to come. It would be very helpful for those workshops if the committee members came to them pre-armed with questions, so you're very clear about what it is that you still need advice on prior to making a decision. And any advance notification we have of those would be helpful too, because we can prepare for them.
I'm new to this plan change stuff, so I like structure, and if I had a structure on the introduction of the plan change, workshops in it, and then when the big decisions are made or advice is given along the way, I could do that. But I'm just swimming into a big blue ocean, and I don't know what the next thing is done. So if I got a structure of what the plan change process is in the decision making, because for me it's just we've done a few workshops. We're expected to make decisions before the workshops. You know, it comes back really mixed. So I just need a framework of how you process a plan change from the beginning to the decision, and then I can make sense of it. At the moment, I only see snapshots, and that might be because I'm new to the game, but it really is confusing, and then trying to do due diligence, because as per the Act that established this group, and I try to work really hard to cover it, we're not only there to give a Te Ao Māori view, but we also actually need to check with those constituents, those members as well. So these are the battles that I have, but I could really do with a framework, and I don't mind if the framework's a month or even a week. I know what I'm working with. I just don't know what the parameters are at the moment. So that would be appreciated if you could.
So Chair, can I respond? So staff have in the past tried to paint a picture of the longer term decision making process around the plan change, and we can reproduce that paper and maybe flesh it out in terms of this process. But what we're currently working on, or what we're currently working to, is the process that was set up many years ago in relation to the Tank Group process, and it has been the subject of a discussion at this table, and was also again raised at the workshops, which was effectively to, in the very early formative stages of this plan, to consult with members of the community, to bring a plan to this committee, to identify where there were non-consensus items and bring those items to you. So in the absence of directions otherwise, staff are continuing on that process. So the workshops, we totally understand the complexity of this and the difficulty, and I don't envy committee members, being on the receiving end of such a significant, complicated and an important document. So that's why we would also appreciate any specific guidance or direction around the makeup of those workshops, or and I believe we've had some backward and forward on what would some field trips look like, who would they be of use to. But one of our challenges here is that we seem to have some parts of this committee who are probably quite happy just to proceed along that basis, and others aren't, which is entirely their prerogative. So.
Mr. Chairman,
we do feel like we are progressing a process.
Motion be put.
Yep. I don't know what the process is.
Okay, we can have
A
this.
schedule of decision making.
Yes,
Just give me a schedule.
I think
We
that's
can have this
reasonable.
discussion in terms of communication later, or I'd like to put the motion. All in favour of the motion? That's
Mr.
your
Chair?
motion? Yes.
Given that we're combining the two motions, can I ask that I have a caucus or a redraft or put together the motion over lunch and bring that back to the table after lunch? Would that work? Or do we want to try and nut it out word for word in an open forum now? I'm quite happy to, while we're having lunch, to sit with colleagues and advisors to redraft the motion and put it back on the table for after lunch.
Chair, it doesn't need redrafting. It's there, ready to go.
This is it.
Ready to go.
Okay.
So it's the two.
It's the two.
All in favour?
Aye.
Against? Okay.
Just to comment though, Mr. Chair, I think Jenny makes a good point. Can we have a schedule and a timeline, and the tangata whenua reps in particular can look at that and say, is that sufficient or not,
Yes.
or make recommendations, and then also the content of workshops based on the decisions they're needing to make. So I think, to be fair, there is an information vacuum, and we may have distributed that previously, but we get lots of documents and...
Sure, yep. No, we can. And just to be really short on it, the plan was in the October meeting to adopt the plan change for notification, and we've got at least one, if not two, workshops between now and then to answer any further questions that people have. So that was plan A. And one of the things that would be really helpful to get some feedback on is whether that timeline is problematic for any reason, and what are the issues that need further advice drilled into.
Is it possible to produce that timeline by the end of meeting today so that we can distribute
Yeah,
that?
I think we can. Yep.
It'll be as you described.
Yeah.
Just before we go to lunch,
The meeting.
before we go to lunch, I just want to clarify something. I did not, my communication regarding the council's decision came via Billy Brogue. It did not come directly from the CEO, so that's why I said I'm waiting for a formal email. Kia ora.
I'm sure he can do that.
Lunch is served, I understand.